The dim glow of a flickering bulb cast long shadows across the cold concrete floor of Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. The walls were thick, the air stale with decades of sweat and regret. Inmates lay curled up in their bunks, some snoring softly, others wide awake, staring at the ceiling like ghosts trapped in their own pasts. James Earl Ray wasn't like them. Lying on his bunk, hands folded behind his head, he counted each flicker of the dying light bulb above him. His mind was miles away, beyond the iron bars and razor wire, beyond the mountains that swallowed this God-forsaken place. Freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a plan. And if everything went right, by the time the sun rose, he'd be gone. But Brushy Mountain wasn't any ordinary prison. They called it inescapable for a reason. The guards were ruthless, their eyes trained to spot the slightest irregularity. The walls weren't just thick, they were a fortress built to swallow men whole. The inmates whispered stories of failed escapes, men who had vanished into the night only to be dragged back, battered and broken. Ray had no intention of being one of them. For weeks he had studied everything, the guards' routines, the shift changes, the gaps in security. Every move they made, he memorized like scripture. He knew when they laughed over their coffee, when they leaned against the railings distracted. And most importantly, he knew about the 15-minute window, the sliver of time between the evening head count and the night patrol's first round. 15 minutes? That was all he had, but he wasn't about to waste a second. The first step in any escape was tools. The prison workshop was his best bet. Under the guise of repairing furniture, he had managed to smuggle out a thin, jagged piece of metal, small enough to hide, but strong enough to pick a lock. But it wasn't enough. The ventilation shaft in his cell was bolted shut, its screws rusted from years of neglect. If he could pry them loose, he'd have a way out. But there was one problem: his cellmate. Larry Red Johnson was a heavy sleeper, but he was also unpredictable. A man who once stabbed another inmate over a cigarette wasn't exactly the kind of person Ray wanted waking up mid-escape. He needed to be careful. That night, he waited. The prison was never truly silent, but it had its moments, brief pockets of quiet where only the hum of the distant generator could be heard. Lying still, Ray listened, the rhythmic breathing of Red, the occasional shuffling of boots in the hallway. Then, silence. He moved. Slowly, he slid his hand under the thin mattress, fingers closing around the metal shard wrapped in cloth. He stood on his bunk, pressing his ear to the cold steel door. No footsteps. Good. Reaching up, he wedged the metal into the first screw. It was tighter than he expected. Every twist sent a dull ache through his fingers, but he kept going. Minutes passed. His arms trembled, sweat beading on his forehead. The screw finally gave, letting out a faint metallic click. One down. The second screw was looser, coming out with less effort. The third took longer, nearly slipping from his grip. His breath was slow, controlled. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Then came the fourth. It refused to budge. He gritted his teeth, applying more pressure. The metal shard slipped, scraping against the screw head. He froze, holding his breath. Red stirred in his bunk, mumbling something incoherent. Ray didn't move. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then with a final push, the screw popped free. The grate hung loose. Carefully, he lifted it, his muscles straining as he hoisted himself up. The shaft was narrower than he had anticipated, the air thick with dust. He fought the urge to cough as he crawled forward, each movement slow and deliberate. The prison's ventilation system was a labyrinth, but he had memorized it. Left at the first junction, straight past the second. He counted the turns, feeling the vibrations of footsteps echoing through the metal. He was close. Then, voices, guards. He pressed himself against the cold steel, heart pounding. The voices faded, footsteps retreating. He exhaled shakily and moved on. Minutes later, he reached the exit, a grated vent overlooking the outer yard. Below, a single guard patrolled, his flashlight cutting through the night. Ray waited. Timing was everything. The guard paused, pulling out a cigarette. His back turned. Now Ray pried the grate open and slipped through, lowering himself into the shadows. The grass was damp beneath his fingers. He could feel the cool night air against his skin. For the first time in years, he wasn't surrounded by walls, but he wasn't free yet. The fence was 20 yards away, barbed wire coiled at the top. He sprinted, his breaths ragged. Behind him, the prison stirred. A voice on a radio, a distant shout. They had noticed. He reached the fence, fingers gripping the cold metal. He climbed, ignoring the searing pain as the barbs tore into his palms. Then, a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past his ear, followed by another. The guards were closing in. Ray dropped to the other side, hitting the ground hard. He rolled, pushing himself up. The woods loomed ahead, dark and endless. He ran. Branches tore at his skin, the damp earth swallowing his footsteps. The wail of sirens filled the night, but they were behind him now. The scent of pine filled his lungs. Freedom was close, but the hunt had just begun. Ray had no time to celebrate. His heart pounded as he sprinted deeper into the woods, each step sinking into the soft earth. The sirens behind him grew louder, but he focused on the sound of his own breathing. Steady, controlled. He needed to disappear. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy above, leaving him in near total darkness. His feet ached, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Somewhere behind him, dogs barked. Bloodhound trackers. He cursed under his breath. The guards weren't wasting any time. Ray changed direction, darting toward the rocky hills that loomed in the distance. He had read about these mountains, knew how treacherous they could be. If he could reach higher ground, he might stand a chance. The climb was brutal. Loose rocks tumbled under his weight. His palms, already shredded from the fence, burned as he pulled himself up. Then, headlights. Far below, on a winding dirt road, a convoy of vehicles sped toward the prison. Reinforcements. Ray forced himself upward, muscles screaming in protest. His lungs burned, but he couldn't stop now. He reached the peak and collapsed, chest heaving. Below, the lights of the prison flickered like distant stars. He had made it this far, but the real challenge had just begun. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, a vast wilderness where a single mistake could mean death. Brushy Mountain was behind him. But survival? With the prison lights now distant specks behind him and the vast wilderness ahead, Ray knew one thing: he was free. But for how long? Please like, subscribe the Escape Files for more thrilling stories.